Hi, everybody. This PowerPoint and lecture is going to look a little bit more closely at Plato's dialogue, the Crito, which you should have read for today. I'm going to tell you a little bit about who these characters are, what's going on with Socrates, why he happens to be in jail at this time, and who this guy Crito is who's talking to him. That'll help inform what's going on in this exchange that you have in your text between Socrates and his friend Crito. It'll also help illuminate some of the material in the next reading, Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from the Birmingham jail, in which King actually compares himself to Socrates. So it's important to understand who Socrates is and what his general method was in order to understand why he's in jail at this time and why he's been sentenced to death. Socrates and the Socratic method are considered foundational to Western philosophy. So Socrates was a man who lived in ancient Greece from 469 to about 399 BCE. BCE is before the Common Era. Plato, who actually wrote the dialogue Crito, was Socrates' student. And Plato was one of many who was a follower of Socrates, followed him around and tried to write down a lot of Socrates' teachings. So what we have here is a text written by Plato in which Socrates is used as a character and is in dialogue with another person. So most of Plato's dialogues are named after the other person that Socrates is talking to. So Socrates, as I said, lived in Athens, Greece. He was a privileged member of society in Athens, which is going to be important for us to keep in mind later when we compare Socrates and Martin Luther King Jr.'s ideas about justice. Socrates did not write anything down. So everything that we have about Socrates and everything that we know about him was written by his followers. Plato or another follower named Xenophon also preserved some of Socrates' teaching. And then we have a few outside sources as well. For example, the poet Aristophanes uses Socrates as a character in some of his dramatic works. But Socrates himself didn't write anything down. So everything we know about Socrates are from records of things he said and conversations that he had with other people. He was a roving teacher, so he spent a lot of time in the public square in Athens seeking out individuals to have challenging conversations with, and that's ultimately what's going to get him in trouble, as we'll see. He's been sentenced to death by the time that we encounter him in the dialogue Crito. I'll talk a little bit more about the charges there and why he was sentenced to death, but when we encounter him in this text, the Crito, he's already been convicted and he's basically just waiting for the time of his execution. So as I said, Plato's Socrates' student. Unlike Socrates, who didn't write anything down, Plato was a prolific writer. So he really formalized his teachings and intentionally preserved them for posterity, whereas Socrates was much more informal about his methods. So Plato uses Socrates as a character in a lot of his dialogues. Plato's earlier dialogues are probably a pretty good representation of conversations similar to the type that Socrates actually did have with other people. Later dialogues by Plato, he's really just using Socrates as a mouthpiece for his own views. There are lots of ways to tell whether that's happening, including the types of things he has Socrates saying, whether those are consistent with other things that we know about him. So Plato founded a school of philosophy in Athens called the Academy, and he's really committed not just to moving the teachings of his teacher Socrates forward, but to moving his own philosophical ideas forward as well. So what was going on with Socrates and why was he sentenced to death? Well, the charges against Socrates were twofold. The first thing that Socrates was charged with was impiety, and that means not believing in the gods of the state. So he was charged with basically religious incorrectness. At that time, there was no separation of church and state, so it was considered a political act of defiance not to believe in the proper gods. The gods were endorsing the state itself. The other charge against Socrates was corrupting the youth of Athens. So he was charged with leading the young men of the city astray and into bad and improper behavior. Why was he charged with these things? Well, Socrates saw himself as being on a very specific mission. This photo here is of the ruins of an ancient Greek city called Delphi, sometimes pronounced Delphi. And in Delphi in Socrates' time, there was an oracle who was thought to speak for the god Apollo. So people would make pilgrimages to Delphi in order to get some kind of clairvoyant truth from this oracle of the gods. So one of Socrates' friends actually goes to Delphi. And the oracle says to him, Socrates is the wisest man. Now, Socrates isn't too sure about this because he certainly doesn't feel very wise, and he certainly is aware that there are lots of people in Athens with a better reputation for wisdom than he himself has. So now Socrates got a problem because here is this oracle of the gods saying he is in fact the wisest man, but Socrates himself knows this might not be true. So Socrates decides he needs to go on a mission. He needs to see if he can actually find a person who's wiser than he is. And if he can, then his initial instinct is right that he's not actually the wisest man. But if he can't, he will have to accept this oracle's proclamation. So this is where his quest begins, and this quest is ultimately going to be what gets Socrates in trouble. So if he wants to know the answer to this, he's going to have to seek people out who have a great reputation for wisdom. And in Socrates' time, that was 3 different categories of people. So he approached politicians, poets, and artisans as the 3 types of people with the greatest reputation for wisdom in his own time. So unlike today, politicians in ancient Greece had a very, very high reputation. In order to be a politician, you had to be quite highly educated, much more highly than the general population, and you had to be a white male landowning citizen of Athens. So these were definitely the elite of society who had a great reputation for wisdom. And they were tasked with an important task, which is creating and enforcing laws. The poets he sought out because he knew that they constructed very intricate works of art and poetry that Socrates himself often couldn't understand. And so he wanted to approach them to see if they had extra wisdom that would explain the poetry and really help Socrates to understand things that he currently did not. And then artisans, this 3rd category, are skilled laborers, people who possess skills that Socrates himself did not possess. So Socrates approaches these 3 categories of people. They're all pretty prominent in the public eye. So you would definitely notice what each of these classes of people were doing. And what he did with each of them was he would approach them and he would say, wow, you must be really smart because you know a lot about this concept of justice or truth or beauty. And it's not something that I really fully understand. Can you tell me more about it? So Socrates' method was to question the other individual under the guise of trying to gain knowledge about something that individual really claimed to know. So if you're going to go up to a politician, you might say, wow, you seem to know a lot about justice. And being a politician, it's your job to implement justice. I'm not really sure I have a good grasp on that. Can you tell me what it is? Now, the politician who likes his reputation as a wise politician is going to say, oh, I totally know what justice is. I'll be glad to help you out. Let's talk about it. What would happen through the course of these dialogues, though, is that Socrates would ultimately reveal to the person that he was talking to that they don't actually know what they think they know. So the dialogue partner in Socrates' conversations always gets tripped up, always doesn't actually have the definition for the concept, truth, beauty, justice, wisdom, whatever it is that Socrates is trying to get out of them. So what happens is these conversations are taking place in public spaces. Other people are watching and listening. And these people are basically being publicly disgraced. They're being revealed as lacking knowledge that they claim to possess. So Socrates is going to make a lot of very influential enemies this way. The same thing happens with the poets. They're not able to explain the meaning of their own poetry. The same thing happens with the artisans. He finds that they're able to complete tasks, but they're not really able to explain how the whole mechanical or engineering process works. So everyone possesses a lot less knowledge than they really think. So what Socrates concludes here is, first of all, that nobody really knows everything that they think they know. In other words, if I walk up to someone and ask them, wow, you must really know what this concept means, tell me about it. These are concepts that we often think we know, but we don't when we're pressed, and that can be very upsetting. In addition to that, no one will actually admit that they don't know certain things. So Socrates is putting people in a very uncomfortable position. Another thing that happens is that Socrates starts to become really popular among the younger people of the city. So all of the people that he's approaching are really well-known, venerated, and respected members of society, and they're all older men. So the youth, the young men of the city, are just loving this. they think that Socrates is really entertaining to watch, and they really like seeing these people who are considered their social superiors be revealed as people who don't in fact know what they think they know. So what Socrates concludes is that he is in fact the wisest man, not because he possesses knowledge that other people lack, but rather because he is at least aware of what he doesn't know. So Socrates comes up with a really important definition of wisdom, and he says to truly know is to know that you know nothing. In other words, true wisdom is awareness of your own ignorance. So Socrates described himself as performing this act of public service. He knew he was agitating people. He knew he was making people really uncomfortable and even angry. He knew he had this following of very adoring young men who really just enjoyed seeing him reveal the ignorance of their superiors. But he said that he was performing a public service. He said what he was doing, even though it was upsetting to people, was actually good for the state. And he described himself as a gadfly. Now, this isn't a term that we use that much anymore. A gadfly is basically a big biting fly, like a horsefly, that is going to land on horses and cows and basically bite them in the butt and agitate them. So he says Plato has him say in this work, The Apology, which is where the description of Socrates' trial takes place, I am a sort of gadfly given to the democracy by the gods, and the democracy is a large noble horse who is sluggish in its motions and requires to be stung into life. In other words, the state's not going to make changes by itself. People are really inclined towards complacency. And Socrates saw his job and his public service as sort of pushing people into action, waking people up and startling them, surprising them and shocking them. So in response to the charges against Socrates of corrupting the youth of Athens and impiety, he rejects them both. He says he's doing a good thing for the citizens and for the state, and that he is in fact not impious. And he says that instead of sentencing him to death, the state should really be paying him to perform this service. So you can imagine how this went over as a defense for him. He really angered a lot of the jurors, and he was in fact convicted of both impiety and corruption of the youth of Athens and was sentenced to death. So that's all happened by the time we get to the Crito. At that point, Socrates is in jail waiting for the time of his execution to occur. The means of death is that he's going to drink this poison called hemlock, and which will kill him instantly. So Crito shows up, Socrates' friend, and he's trying to convince his friend Socrates to escape from prison. So Socrates, as I said, has gathered a lot of followers by this point, and they really don't want Socrates to be executed. So they know that the court has already handed down its decision. Socrates is in jail, and Crito and his friends have gotten together and gathered up some money in order to bribe the guards and pay for Socrates' passage into exile, pay for him to take a boat or something to another place where he can live out the rest of his years. So Crito shows up and has this conversation with Socrates about all the reasons why he thinks Socrates ought to escape from prison. So Crito makes some pretty convincing sounding arguments. He shows up and he's clearly very upset that his friend and mentor Socrates is in jail and is about to be killed. So if you look back at the reading, you can examine what reasons or premises Crito gives to convince Socrates to escape from prison. So Crito's giving a very impassioned argument, but we can probably locate some informal fallacies there in that argument. So a lot of the things that Crito is saying can be classified as appeals to emotion and appeals to the majority. Where we see some appeals to emotion are on Crito's appeal to Socrates. Think about how your friends will feel if you do die. Think about the effect on your sons. They're going to be without their father. Don't you have an obligation to them? Don't worry, everyone will understand. This escape plan makes sense, and no one will blame you for doing that. And furthermore, if you don't try to escape, it's going to make us look bad. Everyone will think that your friends and supporters just weren't able to get it together to spring you from prison. So Crito's got a strong feeling behind his argument, but we know based on the rules of argumentation that we talked about last time that there are some fallacies present there. So there are a lot we could do with the Crito in a lot of different contexts, but what I want us to use it for is mainly to look at the way in which Crito's argument is constructed. We may agree with his conclusion, right, that Socrates ought not to die, and we would like to see him escape from prison, but the way he makes his argument is problematic. Then Socrates responds, and he responds to Crito by creating an argument for why he actually ought to stay there and accept his fate. And that's based on the idea that he has a duty as a citizen of Athens to obey the law. So this is his conclusion, right? To go back to some of the methods and terminology that we talked about last time, that he shouldn't escape. And he's going to do this by walking his dialogue partner Crito through a series of propositions or premises. And like with a lot of philosophical arguments, he's going to begin with something that everybody's on board with, right? That we should never do injustice willingly. In other words, we should never do something that we know is bad on purpose. Now, most people are going to agree with that, and Crito goes right along with that. And then he says, ill treatment of others, treating others poorly is definitely an injustice. And he kind of expands on that a little bit by saying that even if someone has done something bad to you, treating them poorly is still an injustice. Two wrongs don't make a right, basically. And to escape from prison in this context, he said, would be an ill treatment. Ill treatment of who or of what is the next question, of course. So this is how he kind of fleshes that out. He says if he does this, he would be basically destroying, in this one instance, the laws of Athens, the laws of this city in which he was raised, and whose laws really benefited him throughout his life. There are laws about child rearing, laws about education that really ensured that Socrates grew up to be the educated and successful man that he became. Socrates furthermore says that if I didn't like these laws, if I didn't want to live here, if I found them unjust or unacceptable, I could have left, and I didn't, right? Once he became an adult, he had a choice whether he could stay or go, and he chose to stay and take advantage of those laws. So to leave at this point, to escape from prison, would be to break an agreement that he made with the city and with its laws, and therefore would be an act of injustice. So you can see a lot of strengths of Socrates' argument compared to the weaknesses of Crito's. So we talked earlier about ethics and the law and the differences and similarities between those two. I just want you to think a little bit about how Socrates constructs that, and we're going to compare that to the Martin Luther King Jr. text letter from Birmingham jail. That's all I have for this. You should go on now to the next video, which is on the Martin Luther King reading. And then from that, you can proceed to do the two discussion questions for the day.